for social justice. The hate you give little infants fucks everyone. Today, we'll be discussing communication argumentation through this example, the Thug Life acronym, and the person, identity, and performance of Tupac Shakur. And so we start off by talking about label theory, a concept that we've been discussing. And so when we look at label theory and the way label theory works, and this is very similar to generalizations and stereotypes, a dominant group or somebody with power, a group with power labels somebody. And so that label, oftentimes a generalization or a stereotype, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as individuals embrace the label. In this case, you might think about the thug moniker or the thug life mentality. As it is deployed by dominant groups in society. And we might trace back that history of the word thug and how it is used to demonize individuals. And so as groups in power tend to create communication systems that promote the perspectives of those groups, they also tend to demean others in favor for the norm or the mode of operation that is deemed powerful in any given structure. And so individuals oftentimes embrace the stereotype or the labeling. And this becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy as individuals embrace this term. We see action, and that results in a doubling down and a reification of the original label that, of course, was untruthful. It was a stereotypical label in the first place. What happens oftentimes is this results in a moral panic. We could see this moral panic in the war on crime, the war on drugs, and even the war on terrorism, as these labels are detached from the thing, from bodies and from objects and material realities, and transported and placed everywhere. And so now we are finding the label first and then locating bodies secondly. So there was a study some time ago where a classroom was divided. Half of the class that actually had not performed as well on tests were told that they were the better performing students. The half of the class that actually performed better were told that they were not as proficient as the other half. Over time, and in this study, the actual students that did better on the test ended up doing worse, and the sides flip-flopped. And so you can see there's this self-fulfilling prophecy according to the language that is used by dominant societies to describe us. In this case, the teacher. And so is thug life a stereotypical portrayal or someone that lives outside of societal norms and expectations, or is it a social advocacy message meant to mark the ways in which we marginalize and exclude individuals from very early on, and this ill treatment comes back to harm us all and affect us all negatively. And so remember, the hate you give little infants fucks everybody. Now, this was Tupac Shakur's original meaning of this term. He had it tattooed on his chest. He had a band called Thug Life. He produced an album called Thug Life. Had a clothing line called Thug Life, and today we can find it in many iterations. Lately, The Hate You Give, a very popular book that marks police brutality aimed towards people of color, and now they're making a film out of it, which exactly describes what Tupac was talking about over 20 years ago. And so identity, we see in Tupac, like we see in everybody, a transformation, a manifestation of who they are in relation to who others think they are. right? And because he is successful for a while, and he profits from this identity, we can discuss it as a public artifact, as a text that is worthy of our attention and even examination. Now, ultimately, Tupac meets his bloody demise at only 21 years of age. And so, starring in films, writing, producing, and making albums, performing around the world, and the countless other roles that he fulfilled in his life was cut tragically short because of this identity. And the search remains for who killed Tupac Shakur. Now, we might not know by the end of this lecture, but we can unpack a little bit of the that ended Tupac Shakur's life. Interestingly, and not to make any type of salient comparison here, but we might look at the rhetoric of MLK and Malcolm X, that also these luminaries from their voice, their rhetoric, and also their subject positionality. And so the identity of Tupac, who was Tupac, hard to say, but we can say who society thought he was and what his rhetoric produced within the context in which it exists and is deployed. And so performance. As a performance scholar and a scholar of communication studies, I find it very interesting to look at Tupac's performance. We are all performing identities in different ways and in different contexts. Now, once again, Tupac goes to a school for the arts and becomes a brilliant actor at a very young age. I can only imagine what he would have done if he would have been allowed to live a long life. To quote MLK there. And so Tupac plays a character by the name of Bishop in the movie Juice. Now, Juice is a synonym for power here, and Tupac's character Bishop wants power. In this scene with Omar Epps, Tupac's character transforms into the typical way dominant society understands the term thug. He looks Omar's character straight in the eye and says, "I'm crazy and I don't give a fuck." And after this, you start to see Tupac embrace thug mentality as it is typically deployed. To denigrate individuals, to remove individuals from society even further. And so there's a context at work here. If we want to understand the power context of any given situation, we can look at the artifacts and the texts that surround that situation. And if this is applied to an entire nation or a society, then we can look at the films, we can look at the music, we can look at the television shows that are produced within this context. And so we don't have to go very far in Hollywood to find the racist context that these films are produced within in the situation of the United States of America. And so The Birth of a Nation, a racist film by D.W. Griffiths, is still heralded as a technological achievement, but it also really accurately depicts the context of white superiority at the time. Due to the film, hate groups multiply in numbers, and the film still has influences to this day. And so there's a reordering always at our disposal. Just as words are appropriated, communities can reappropriate and reorder certain narratives to better reflect the past, our present, and then most importantly, where we are going in the future. And so the name, the title, Birth of a Nation of this racist film is now remixed in a 2016 film titled The Birth of a Nation that discusses Nat Turner's slave revolt here. And so I think it's a brilliant reappropriation of this term to think about the dialogue that actually goes into creating a nation. And so, as we turn to reasoning, we'll look at syllogisms, enthymemes, and arguments. And I encourage you to find everyday arguments or enthymemes behind our assertions and our claims that we make um, oftentimes throughout the day. And so reasoning is a contextual process of human interaction. Reasoning, and it's like something like math. We might think of that it's an objective science that describes nature, but really these are symbols that we have applied to nature, and they bring nature into a certain fruition. And so reasoning and logic, while it might appear as a mathematical and objective formula, is really a contextual process of human interaction. And so a syllogistic argument consists of a claim, a premise that provides evidence or proof for the claim. And so we see thug life continually robbed of its message. And so we see this in the thug life meme. The meme comes from the word enthymeme. And so here we have Carlton from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air fame, staying up past his bedtime, thug life. And so a simple premise there. There's a rule given to you by a structure, the family, to overlook that. One is in fact thug life, but it also demeans and denigrates the message here. It's also humorous, which is quite powerful as we overlook the message. And we continue to do so as thug life becomes an app. It becomes memes that are deployed everywhere and synonymous now with a pair of pixelated glasses. And so I didn't choose the thug life chose meme here. Now enthymemes oftentimes are partial, our enthymemes are deployed as partial syllogisms. Go through the premise, proof, evidence, claim, formula. We just deploy partial syllogisms, right? And so an enthymeme, we just make claims, and you are, or the audience is supposed to fill in the blanks of the syllogistic argument. And so there's a small level of argumentation here, denying the rules of bedtime, and this time growing up and being thug life since a very early age, right? That authenticity, that thug life cannot be taught. You either are or you are not. And you could see, if we look at this in the context of power, is a pervasive and quite damaging essentialism that might be applied to certain groups over other groups. And so if A, then is one premise, A is true, premise number two, therefore B. If someone spits at a camera, denies authority, and is aggressive in public, then they are a thug. I have a t-shirt of Tupac spitting at a camera, therefore Tupac is a thug. And so you can see the very basic form of syllogistic argument, but that argument nonetheless seems to be sound according to Aristotelian notions of rhetorical syllogistic arguments. And this is another way that we see thug life just deployed almost everywhere. Another syllogistic argument, universal statement, premise one, valid statement, premise two, therefore assertion. All thugs mean mug the camera and make obscene gestures. Tupac is seen here making an obscene gesture and mean mugging the camera. Therefore, Tupac is a thug. And so we have just very kind of basic reasoning. And if we look online and we see various arguments and we talk to people and they make statements and claims, there usually is some very small form of reasoning or logic behind their assertions. But this does not make the outcome true. In fact, most statements of validity are social beliefs based on constructed context, and the actual outcome depicts a world that is false, and so inaccurately depicts the reality that we are describing. And so Tupac's first album that he makes in high school has a song called Panther Power. He makes a Black Panther mixtape as his first recorded, some of his first recordings in high school. It's not until later on that he goes to New York and hooks up with Biggie Smalls infamously, and starts to embrace more of this thug life as it's typically deployed in dominant society mentality. And that's not to, and that is also a footnote. After he has a few run-ins with authorities, and the society of white domination has treated him in a particular way. And so this social message is always there in Tupac's identity and his rhetoric, but it is continually pushed to the background. And so, as real as it seems, the American dream ain't nothing but a bunch of calculated schemes. And he goes on to say that it's not meant for me. And so this is a statement that he makes in high school on record in a very socially conscious album. And so today we study Tupac in poetry and English classes. We study him as a social advocate. But at the time, the context of white superiority breaks Tupac down and applies a label to him that is almost inescapable. And so there's a logic and a reasoning that is contained in many syllogistic arguments and enthymemes. And this can be sound, but the outcome can be oftentimes false. And so the hate you give little infants fucks everybody is actually a call to social justice and a form of social advocacy that we are just now, with the popularity of the Hate U Give book and film, returning to. But again, where is Tupac in all of this? And so Tupac meets his demise because of his rhetoric. And the way his rhetoric is received in society, he really loses control of in many ways. And so if we look at the album Thug Life, which comes out in 1994, and so this is right when Tupac dies, we can see an embracing of the label. Bury me a G. Don't get it twisted. Pour out a little liquor, mourning those who have died that have also had that Thug Life label applied to them. Stay true, that authenticity we can see. How long will they mourn me? Knowing in his lyrics that he will most likely meet his demise because of his social positionality and his radical rhetoric. Street fame, a desire to live outside of institutional success, cradle to the grave. You were born like this, and then you will die like this in a situation that treats you unfairly. And lastly, street balling, the mainstream desire to have economic success here. Here we see a kind of blueprint of a thug life mentality as it is typically deployed. Now, these are mainstream values: being authentic, mourning your friends, and thinking about how others will mourn you. Being real and honest. And of course, the pursuit of the economic success. And so while we might look at some of the lyrics and we might find those moments of consciousness and calls for social advocacy, we also find an embracing of the typical meanings behind the thug moniker. Now, Tupac, for a while, benefits greatly from this in terms of material success, but ultimately meets his demise due to this rhetoric. Once again, we can look at MLK and Martin Luther King, who states